We're already 2 weeks into the NHL season, so it's about time that I got to some power rankings, which of course you know what that means. It's time to make some people unnecessarily upset because I either rank their team too low, that's usually what it is, or maybe I ranked a team they don't like too highly, or maybe I ranked a team that their team beat above their team, even though everything else suggested the other way around, and that's too difficult to understand. Either way, there's lots of reasons that people probably won't be happy with these rankings. I might be the only one that has these 10 in this order at the top of the NHL, especially considering it's the best time of year for power rankings that make people upset because it's the start of the season where, yeah, overreactions abound, and especially a start of a season where we've seen a lot of the teams that would have been in the top 10 had I gotten one of these out before the start of the season have not great starts to their season, and a few teams that nobody would have expected to be even necessarily playoff contenders this year that have had pretty good starts to their year. And that's always one of the tricks to doing these power rankings. Do you rank a team higher because of the potential that the talent on the roster suggests they should be able to play at? Or do you rank a team higher just because of what they're actually able to put out there? And then there's the recency bias. How much do you take that into account? Obviously, at the start of the season, recency bias is all we have, so that's a little bit helpful, I suppose. But yeah, you got a team like the Avalanche, for example, where I still expect the Avalanche to be one of the best teams in the NHL by the end of the season, but we're not going to see them in the top 10 because they have not had a top 10 start to the season. In fact, they've had more of a bottom 10 start to their season. To me, at least, the obvious answer lies with a mixture between the two, a balance between both of those ends of the spectrum, as is the case with most things. And we'll see that in this list, but I figured why not have some fun, especially at the start of the season, with giving some of these teams that I don't necessarily expect to be in the power rankings in a couple of weeks, or certainly a month, and as we get farther into the season, give them a chance to, have a spot on this list while it lasts. Real quick though, one last thing, and then I promise we'll get to the list itself. I'm going to have a couple of changes to the power rankings this year from how I did them last year, if you watched those. Mostly just before we get to the top 10 itself. I'm going to do away with the honorable mentions. I really feel like they added all that much, and it was, I don't know, I just didn't really feel like they had a lot of structure and didn't really add that much, like I already said. We could have a little bit more fun with it, so that's what we're going to do by having one it's fine team of the week for a team where things have not been going very well and they would like to get things turned around before the house completely burns down around them. And then on the other end of things, the objects and mirrors are closer than they appear team for a team that's still outside the top 10 but has been gaining ground. Similar, I guess, in some ways to the honorable mention, and maybe it will get used that way at times, but this could be a team that's still not necessarily in the top 10 but has been making up a lot of ground over that last week or maybe couple week span. It could be a team like, say, the Kraken last year in December, where they still weren't in the top 10, but they'd won 8 straight games and were getting closer. And I will keep those two teams as ones that are teams outside of the top 10. So even if there's, say, a team that was first place and they have been losing games constantly, I'm not going to have them as the it's fine team, even if that's kind of how things feel, until they drop all the way out of the top 10. So at least get a little bit more inclusion of some other teams into the video. But I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section. If you like that idea, we can figure it out as the season goes along. But let's jump into things with the first ever and this week's It's Fine Team of the Week. And I don't think it's really too much of a surprise to anybody that it is the Nashville Predators. Now, if I had time to do the power rankings after the first week, the Kraken had a back-to-back the first weekend, so there wasn't really time to get the first week's power rankings out. It might have been the Edmonton Oilers, as they kind of started out their season a lot like last year, in some ways cosplaying as the San Jose Sharks, but they've at least gotten a couple of wins. Meanwhile, the Predators are 0-5. Not even a loser point there, just straight up 0-5-0. And this is a team that did have some playoff aspirations with some big additions in the offseason that we are all pretty well aware of. And I still think, I mean, obviously there's plenty of time. It's just 5 games in. This is a team that has the talent to get it together and push for one of those wild card spots. But especially with the top of the division already playing as well as it is, and a couple of other teams that a lot of people thought they might be fighting for those wild card spots with, also getting off to good starts, they can't afford to keep digging this hole deeper and deeper as we get into, especially as we get into November. And then for the team that's getting things turned around or up and coming, I don't know, we're 5 games into the season. It's still pretty early on, so in some ways this is just more of an honorable mention. It's going to be harder to really say that a team is having a rebound when, you're still just within the first 10 games of the season. Either way, The Minnesota Wild are going to get that spot for me in this one. The Capitals were right there as well, so spoiler, neither of those teams are going to be in the top 10. But for the Wild, they do still have a point in all of their first 5 games, a 3-0-2 record to start off the season, which I think, some people could argue maybe that's worthy of the top 10, especially if I'm going to be going with a little bit more of just how have they been playing so far and not necessarily thinking about which teams are actually going to have some staying power in the top 10 as the season goes along. But 2 of those wins are against the Blue Jackets, which, no offense to Blue Jackets fans, I think we all know that that's not a team that's going to be a powerhouse this season. So I'm not necessarily convinced that the Wild are, or have, I should say, been playing as good as their record. And had they come out on the winning side of that shootout against the Kraken, they probably would have been on the list. In fact, they certainly would have been. They would have probably even been in the 9th spot, because between the Wild and the first 2 teams in the top 10, they've kind of had a rock, paper, scissors as far as the head-to-head matchups that these 3 teams have had already at this point in the season. Because in the 10th spot, I do have the Seattle Kraken. Now, look, I'm not going to try and pretend that part of the reason I have the Kraken here isn't that it's a little bit of homerism bias. Obviously, I want to have the Kraken in the top 10 at some point this season, and this might just be that chance. So, do I expect them to be a top 10 team as we get deeper into the season? No, probably not, but they are 4-2 to start out the year with 3 straight wins, and they did hand Calgary their first loss of the season in the most recent game. So, for the Kraken, it's 8 points in 6 games, which is the best start that they've had in franchise history, which includes the year that they made it to the second round of the playoffs. Yeah, I know there's probably going to be some people who are going to roll their eyes and maybe even tune out of the video because a Kraken fan has put the Kraken in the top 10. But again, like I said, there's a lot of teams that will probably end up in this top 10 in pretty short order that just have not had great starts to the season and need to catch up and prove that they're as good as they should be based on the players they have on their roster. And until then, a team like the Kraken that's won 2/3 of their games is going to sit in the 10th spot. Speaking of teams that have won 2/3 of their games, in the 9th spot I have the St. Louis Blues, and this is where Wild fans will probably not be too happy as they were just outside the top 10, and they beat the Blues 4-1, the Blues being in the 9th spot. But like I said, the Kraken beat the Wild, the Blues beat the Kraken, and the Wild beat the Blues. So, I mean, you had to figure out how to do it some way, and then of course there's Capital fans who could make an argument for their team being above all 3 of those. Either way, for the Blues, kind of like the Kraken, it's been a bit of an unexpectedly good start to the season. This is another team that I don't really expect to hang around in the top 10 for too long. They haven't necessarily had the hardest start to the season as far as schedule is concerned, though I would say between the Kraken, Wild, and Blues, the Blues have probably had the hardest strength of schedule to this point. But, it's been a weird start to the year, so who really knows by the time things shake out whether we'll feel the same way at the end of the year. Moving on, in the 8th spot, I have the Tampa Bay Lightning, a team that, although it's not necessarily one I would have picked to see in the top 10 by the end of the year, it's a team that maybe has a little bit more staying power than some of the others as far as teams that have gotten off to good starts. And sure, they did lose their most recent game to the Ottawa Senators, but they did get off to a 3-0 start to start the season, including beating the Hurricanes with their opening game, and then having their next game postponed because of a hurricane, but then coming back with wins over Vancouver and Vegas, both teams that I expect to be towards the top of the Pacific when everything is said and done at the end of the season. So, a much harder strength to schedule to start their year, and they came out with 3 wins. Obviously, the most recent loss to the Senators doesn't help things and knock them down this list. Had they taken care of business in that game, then they probably would have been much higher up, but a good start to the season so far. Obviously, Vasilevsky getting off to, at least the first 2 games were pretty good, giving up 1 goal in each of the first 2 games, then 3 in the next, and obviously the loss to the Senators. So maybe it's been a bit of a downward start to his season, but it started out on a good note. So either way, as a whole, Vasilevsky's gotten off to a pretty good start, and obviously Kucherov has gotten off to a very good start as he leads the league in scoring with 7 goals already on the season in just those 4 games that they've played. And when you add his 2 assists to it, it makes him more than a 2 points per game player early on in the year. Up next in the 7th spot, and this is another one that I think might be a source of consternation in the comments, but I do have the team with the most games under their belt so far, thanks to the international series with the Sabres. It is the New Jersey Devils. They also have the most points with 11 so far, a 5-2-1 record for the Devils. And so yeah, there's a lot of reasons that maybe they could be higher than 7th, but at the same time, as we'll see with some of the teams above them, even if they haven't played as many games, they've had better starts than the Devils have, not by a lot, obviously. 5-2-1's a pretty good start, and the Devils are a team that I kind of do expect to stick around the top 10 for most of the season, although people kind of expected that of them last year, that after a playoff run the previous year, they were going to be a team trending upwards, and kind of like the Kraken, that didn't really happen. But who knows, maybe this is the year for the Devils. It certainly has been a good start, and especially a good start in net, where they've been getting pretty good goaltending from both goaltenders, especially Jake Allen, who's only played the 2 games, but they have been very good games. Again, just 2 of them, but he has the best goaltending stats in both goals against average and save percentage in the NHL among goaltenders that have played at least 2 games. And then, just in case being in the 7th spot didn't already annoy Devils fans enough, which I promise was not intentional in spite of how I might be making it sound, in the 6th spot I have a team that they shut out 3-0 in the Utah Hockey Club, which maybe I should have below the Devils just for being called the Hockey Club. That's a problem that hopefully they'll be fixing in the next offseason by actually having a real name. Either way, it's been a very good start to the season outside of that loss to the Devils and one other loss that was in overtime. For them, really, that loss to the Devils was their worst of the season, but the Hockey Club got off to a 3-0 start, and yeah, it hasn't necessarily always been convincing. They've been giving their fans a lot of hockey to start the year, with 4 overtime games already among their first 6, but they have come out of it with a 4-1-1 record for 9 points in those first 6 games, which by points percentage is better than what the Devils have at the very least. And again, this is not necessarily a team that I think will stick around the top 10. I'm not necessarily as bought into the Hockey Club as a lot of people are. Now, I still think it's a team that is going to be in the mix for a wild card spot in the West, but I don't expect them to stick around the top 3 in the Central, especially with some of the other starts that other teams have gotten near the top of that division. And I'm definitely not talking about like Colorado and Nashville, who could still rise up the rankings. I mean, I pretty much guarantee that Colorado will rise up into that top 3 at some point this season. So for Utah, it's just been a very good start to the season, which is always something that's good in a new city, getting some new fans interested in the game to have the team playing well out of the gate. And just to be clear, the reason I have them above the Devils is not just because they have a higher points percentage or because I just want the feel goods for them having a chance to be in the top 10 before eventually I think they'll likely end up sliding out of it, though it might take a couple of weeks. It's also because they do have a couple of pretty impressive wins. Now, the Bruins haven't necessarily had a gangbuster start to their season, but they did beat the Bruins. They are, however, also the only team that has beat the New York Rangers so far. It took overtime, but they beat the Rangers, and that certainly is a team in the Rangers that not only has had a good start to their season, but I also think is absolutely for real. Which is not necessarily something that I think I can also say about the team just above Utah in the 5th spot in the Calgary Flames. Now, the Flames are coming off their first loss of the season, a 4-0-1 record to start things out, as they lose the first minute in overtime against Seattle. So, another reason to have Seattle in the top 10. They beat one of the undefeated teams. But for the Flames, obviously a great start to the season, starting 4-0, including winning the first game in the Battle of Alberta, which, beating the Oilers as they stand right now might not seem so impressive, but once we get to the end of the year and the Oilers have done the same sort of thing they did last year, it'll be a win that looks a little bit better on the record. And obviously, regardless of where the 2 teams stand at any given time, whoever wins one of those matchups, the fans are always going to feel good about. For the Flames, though, this is a team that while I don't necessarily know that I think they're for real, I don't think they're going to stick around in the top 10, another one of these teams that might be making a rare appearance here in the early goings. I think they might be better than I expected going in. I pretty much had them locked into the 6th spot in the Pacific Division. I really just didn't think much of them. Now, I mean, the Sharks and Ducks are going to be in 8th and 7th spots. I thought the Flames were pretty locked into that 6th spot, but they've gotten off to a good start, and Seattle has been playing pretty well on top of that, and they certainly gave the Kraken everything they had and almost came away with that 5th straight victory, in which case they would have been a little bit higher on this list, even if I don't necessarily believe that it's sustainable over the course of the whole year. And that's easy enough to say right now. That's just complete projection, so, for now, they've been winning the games that they can win, and that's all you can really ask, aside from, again, the overtime loss, but it's still 1 point away from a perfect record through the first 5 games, and they've been doing it by scoring a lot of goals. plus getting some pretty good goaltending. Now, if you've made it to this point and you think I'm totally out of my mind with some of the teams that I have in this top 10, especially based on what people thought was going to be the case going into the season, and even though I've explained that I'm giving a little bit more credit to teams that I don't expect to stay in the top 10 just because of good starts to the season that might not last as we get deeper into it, there is at least one team here that is higher up on this list than I would have been if I was just going purely off of how they started the season, because of where I think their season is likely headed, and also, to be fair, some of where last season ended for them. That being, in fourth, I have the Florida Panthers, who are sitting right back atop their division with a 4-2-1 record through 7 games. And it hasn't always been convincing. They are a -1 goal differential so far through those 7 games, even with those 9 points in the first 7. And some of that was losing Matthew Tkachuk for a few games due to illness. But this is still a team that, in spite of the deep playoff run going through all the way into 7 games into the Stanley Cup final with that much shorter offseason than most teams, they've pretty much picked up right where they left off, and like I said, leading the division and setting themselves up well for when they really get into the flow of things. They're going to be another hard team to get out in the playoffs, and who knows, maybe they, like the other team from Florida a little while ago, can make 3 back-to-back trips to the Stanley Cup final. After all, the team that they faced in that Stanley Cup final has not gotten off to the best start, and yeah, who knows if that has anything to do with their light playoff run, but the Panthers, no sort of hangover so far to speak of. And then we get to the top 3 teams, which, at least to this point early on in the season, I think these 3 teams have kind of set themselves a tier above everyone else, in part because I think they're actually for real and have gotten off to good starts in the season. Now, that can all change. It's still so early in the season. This could change pretty drastically if one of these teams goes on a losing streak in this next week, but I really don't expect that to happen. Starting in the 3rd spot with the Dallas Stars, who were one of the last teams to have an undefeated record. Now, after starting out 4-0, they did lose 1 game just by a goal, but in regulation to the Washington Capitals, so they are the last team on this list with a regulation loss so far to start out the season. This is still a very good Stars team that, among those 5 wins that they have so far, includes back-to-back night wins and back-to-back shutout wins over the Islanders and Kraken. And at least the Kraken have gotten off to a pretty good start to the season. The Islanders have had at least a respectable start. And yeah, a couple of their other wins, or I guess their 3 other wins to this point, are against Nashville, who we already know the kind of start that they've gotten off to, as well as Edmonton, who very well was in the same spot that Nashville was a week ago. And then the Sharks, who are going to be in the spot that Nashville is by the end of the season. So not necessarily the 3 most impressive wins based on how teams are playing right now. But like I said, the back-to-back shutout, back-to-back nights, as well as just being all around one of the most well-rounded, solid teams the NHL has to offer right now. This is a Stars team that I would be kind of surprised if they find their way outside the top 10, maybe even over the course of the entire season. But it's a long season. We'll wait and see. And speaking of teams that should likely be a mainstay in this top 10 throughout the course of probably the entire season, in the 2nd spot is another team that I think fits that description in the New York Rangers. Now, the Rangers do have also 1 loss, though this time it came in overtime, so a 4-0-1 record to start the season for the Rangers, and it's been a pretty decisive 4-0-1, as that 1 is the only close game that they've played so far. The overtime loss to the Hockey Club, which doesn't really roll off the tongue, but either way, that loss to Utah is their only loss so far this season. It came in overtime, and it's also the only game that's really even been close, with the most lopsided one being their first game of the season, the 6-0 stomping of the Penguins. And like I said before, this is a Rangers team that is absolutely for real. Obviously, Shesterkin got paid to show how serious they are about taking advantage of this window that the Rangers have available. Really, the only question for the Rangers already at this point in the season is, can they make it count when the spring rolls around? Now, obviously, we'll just have to wait and see for quite a while about that. At least for now, though, the Rangers have gotten off to a very good start, and it also, I would say, certainly helps their chances of continuing this, that 3 of those wins have come on the road as their perfect 3-0-0 on the road. So yeah, getting some wins away from home should help that they have already a good record and a lot more home games. Well, I guess 1 more home game left as the season goes along. The point is they've gotten off to a good start on the road, and that's pretty impressive. Not as impressive as the team that I have in first place, though. and it's the only undefeated team left. It has to be the Winnipeg Jets. Now for the Jets, this is a team that's built a bit of a reputation for having good starts to the season and then having a mid-season, I don't know if collapse is the right word. They usually still find their way into the playoffs, but the start of the season hasn't necessarily been the issue for them. It's whether or not they can continue that into the back half of the season. Now, we're still a long ways away from there, and things have certainly gone to plan to this point. They're not only 5-0, and obviously being 5-0 helps this, but they also have the best goal differential to plus 16 already in those 5 games, so outscoring their opponents by 3 goals per game. Yeah, this has been a dominating start to their season, with Hellebuck in particular looking like he has his sights set on another Vezina. Especially considering that, sure, Jake Allen has had a great 2 games so far, but Hellebuck has had a great 4 games. He's given up just 5 goals in the first 4 games of his season, and 3 of those came against the Sharks, which, if you said Hellebuck gave up 3 goals against the Sharks, you probably wouldn't think by itself that meant he's really had a great start to the season, but yeah, for whatever reason, the Sharks are the only team that seems like they've been able to at least kind of figure out Hellebuck. Now, they did give up 8 goals back the other way, so maybe it was just a bit of a throw everything at the wall and who cares what comes back the other way, and a couple things will stick. But either way, it's been a good start to the season for the Jets. Really not much of anything to complain about for the Jets. They're second only to the Rangers in goals per game and first in goals against per game. So obviously things going pretty well, and they'll have even more of a chance to further stamp their place atop this top 10 as their next 3 games are all teams that are currently on this list, even if they are some of the teams that we don't necessarily expect to stick around as the season goes along, those being the Blues, the Flames, and as much as I'd really like them to stick around, also the Kraken. And then they get the Leafs after that, so yeah, 4 games that can continue to prove how good the Jets are here early on, if they can continue to make things happen like they have to this point in the season. So there you have it, my top 10 teams through 2 weeks of the NHL season. Again, like I said, for anybody that might have skipped to the beginning, this is based largely on how teams have played so far, and with a little bit of weighting of what I expect to happen as the season goes along. So yeah, it's not necessarily going to be the list that a lot of people have, because a lot of people will still have teams like, maybe not Colorado and Edmonton, but maybe like Toronto or Boston, some of these teams that will probably be in the top 10 as the season goes along, just haven't had quite as good of starts to the season. Figured we might as well give some of these teams that have had better starts their time in the sun before reality eventually comes crashing down. But let me know what you think down in the comment section below, who your top 10 teams would be, how you would decide your top 10 teams, and what you think of the new additions to this top 10 if you were around last year, what other suggestions you might have for the top 10. I'd love to hear all of it down in the comment section, and we'll have this evolve as the season goes along. Until next time, though, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken! Stay in that top 10, please.